Oh, hey folks, welcome back to Game Geeks. I'm your host, Kurt Wiegel. Sorry, I was just getting down to the theme music at the beginning. So today's episode, we are talking about a pair of Pathfinder products for you to consider. I considered drawing out those P's a lot farther and just like trying to do as many as I could, but then I realized I'd fall all over myself. The first one we're going to talk about is the Guide to the Inner Sea Gods, which is essentially a giant religions book, followed by Mythic Adventures. So we're going to start with this one because it's going to be a little bit easier to go through. As presented in the Inner Sea World Guide in the Pathfinder campaign setting, they gave you their own religion and their own set of deities to work with. Everything from Asmodeus, who's been popping up quite a bit lately in a lot of fiction, to Aristil, who was sort of the lawful good god of hunting in small communities, down to Lameshtu, the goddess of monsters and misery. A whole set of religions for you to choose from there. Now, these have been detailed in a couple of different places. They're in the Pathfinder core rulebook. Little blurbs talk about their weapons, talk about their domains, that sort of thing. They get a little bit more mention later on in some of the religion guides like Gods of Balance, Gods of Decay, that sort of thing. Now, they get their whole own book. I have a real soft spot in my heart for religions in fantasy settings. For some reason, whenever I build a fantasy setting, that's one of the first things I develop is the religion and the mythology. That's one of the first places I go when I look at a new campaign setting. I'm just kind of a sucker for that. Here, each god gets a considerable length of time dedicated to them. Now, the breakdown on that is some of the basic factual information about the god itself, such as where they come from, the main centers of their religion, alignment, domains, how to show obedience to your god, and then you get a little widget you can add on later on in the game, during that game day, as long as you've done some level of obeisance. Then there are a couple of other classes buried in at the back. You've got your evangelist, your exalted, and your sentinel. More on those in just a minute. Then it gives you this really big description of the god, what they're about, where they're from, sort of their history. And then it gets into more detail what the church itself is like, what happens to the people who worship these gods, temples and shrines, a priest's role, why they adventure, what sort of clothes that they wear, so that way it's not all boring and white robes and hoods and stuff like that, and all your gods aren't all in, S&M bondage gear, unless you happen to worship Zon-Kuthon or something, who seems to be the god of Cenobites from the Hellraiser movies. Beyond that, relationship with other religions, what their realm is like in the cosmology, etc. Big details. I can't go into every one. I can tell you a few of my favorites, and I'll blushingly admit one of them is the aforementioned and slightly off-the-line Zon-Kuthon, just because I got a soft spot in my heart, not for S&M Bondo gear, but for Hellraiser. I kind of like the idea of the Cenobites for some reason. It's a weird, almost fetish thing I have with that mythology. But personally, my favorite god in this entire batch, probably a lot of people's, is Caden Kalliane, mainly because he's an ascended mortal. He was a mercenary who happened to go through the test of the Starstone, which is one of the ways that you can ascend to godhood. But he did it almost on a drunken dare. He emerged 3 days later. He doesn't know what happened, and he stepped out a godling and sort of bemused and a little confused about what happened. And that sort of described his history as a god too, just, I'm a god, this is kind of cool. He's the chaotic good god of adventurers, of wine, of ale, of freedom, and just generally going around doing good things. I think it would be an absolute blast to play a neutral good cleric of Caden Kalliane, just because, you get to do good stuff, you get to have some fun, you don't have to be a stick in the mud, and I think it would just be an absolute hoot to do. So, because this is a Pathfinder product, they can't just simply give you background information. They have to give you new rules, new numbers, and new widgets, cool powers, however you want to describe it, to apply to your characters. One of the ways they give you this is with new prestige classes for you to play with. These include the evangelists, who are the people who go around telling people about their faith, sort of preaching the religion and getting people to convert. You've also got the exalted, who exemplify the teachings of their faith. They're these are the chosen of the gods. And finally, the sentinel, who is the martial arm of the religion, and sort of, if you want to do a paladin, but you are of a neutral good or evil god, or a neutral or evil god, this is one route you can take to become a more martial approach to the priest class. Now, I want you to think about this for just a second. Your average cleric priest is pretty damn martial to begin with. They've got a really good base attack bonus. They've got a decent hit die. Depending on your deity, your weapon selection can be pretty nice. There's not much that's a weenie pushover of most of the deities in 3rd edition, 3.5 Pathfinder, or Dungeons & Dragons in general. These were modeled after the Knights Templar. So, your cleric is not some monastic little nerdy guy who can speak a bunch of languages and talk about religion and maybe have a spell or two for utility. These are spell-chucking badasses for the forces of good, neutrality, or evil. They just happen to be spell-chucking badasses with some decent attack bonuses and not a whole lot of range spells. Most of their spells are up close and personal. If you want the range spells, you go with the druid. And then it gives you magic items, feats, what you would normally expect in the back third of this book from a Pathfinder product. You have to really like remembering a lot of fiddly bits to enjoy Pathfinder. If you do, great. Good on you, mate. And this is a fantastic guide for faith, for religion, and for that entire, what I consider third of the cosmology and mysticism of a game. Switching gears slightly, speaking of spell-slinging badasses for the forces of whatever, we've got Mythic Adventures. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a game of subtle backroom politics. This is not Game of Thrones at this juncture. When you get into Mythic Adventures, you're talking EXALTED. That level of role-playing, specifically as applied to Pathfinder. Now, folks, I'm going to warn you. What you essentially do, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but I want to make this clear up front. When you get into the Mythic Adventures, the Mythic role-playing piece of this, you are essentially adding an entire other class, even though it's not called a class, an entire another level, even though it's not called a level, an entire another set of abilities and feats, even though they're not necessarily called feats in the process. So, what do we have with these? Well, what you've got is, you've got your mythic path. That is, what sort of uber powerful character are you playing? Honestly, as I read through this, I remember back to Dawnforge, which was a Fantasy Flight Games product back in, oh dear God, the early 2000s. It was back when they were when Wizards of the Coast was having their competition for the next major setting. This was one of the mid-level finalists for it, where you played the mythic level characters at the dawn of the golden age of that setting. Your mythic paths include the Archmage, the Champion, Guardian, Hierophant, Marshal, and Trickster. Wow, that sounds like 6. Well, it is 6. Sounds like those 6 might be tied to the 6 abilities. Huh. Not directly, but there are some real parallels. Then you've got your mythic tiers, which is essentially an additional level feature that you have to remember as you go through each one. Now, there's nowhere does it states that you get a level, then you get a mythic tier, then you get a level, then you get a mythic tier. Because the mythic tiers are not acquired through experience points. They're acquired through trials, which is the crap you have to do in order to prove your awesomehood and your ability to continue on that mythic path. With each mythic path, you have path abilities that come with every tier you've got. So there are the general ones, which is like first level, you get the hard to kill, you get a mythic power and a surge plus 1d6, and then at first level you pick your mythic path, but you don't ever get to vary from that. Clearly, some of these mythic paths are more meant for some classes than others. If you really wanted to, you could have a fighter who had the Archmage path, although it'd be a really weird fighter. It'd be a very strange fighter. Clearly, for this, something like the Wizard or the Sorcerer is more apt, but screw it, Bard. You've got arcane spells as a Bard, throw it in there. Magus or some of the other of the alternate spell-slinging classes would fit nicely in there. The Summoner, for example, would fit nicely into the Archmage as well. At each level, your power gets more and more obscene. Honestly, at each tier, your power gets more and more obscene because you've got more things you can do, your abilities that you choose from, you can make better magic items, you can lace more power into your spells, etc. Every one of these, and like I said at the beginning, this is not a game for the subtle. This is a game for Hercules. Using Hercules as a model for a mythic path is not a bad thing because he had all those trials, he had all that crap he had to do, and at the very end, he ascended into godhood and sitteth at the right hand of Zeus the Father Almighty. Beyond all that, you've got your feats that go in. At the back of the book, there are some mythic monsters. There are ways to make your monsters more mythic. There's an example of an adventure that you have back there that you can use to sort of give you a model for what the mythic path adventures should look like. I'll be honest, I have a couple of small criticisms I can level at this book. One of them, I feel like it shorts the GMs a little bit in terms of, oh crap, what do I do? My players suddenly want to become godlings. How do I handle this? How do I incorporate this into my game? Secondly, I think Pathfinder already has a lot of balls you got to keep in the air when you're running it. If you don't have a good attention span, if you don't have a good memory for what your individual abilities and widgets do, or if you just have analysis paralysis like I do, and you're trying to remember, okay, should I take this option or this option? If I take this option, I get these domain spells. But if I go with this one, I get a power and a domain spell. What should I do? Well, it's a D8. Why can't it be a D6? Why shouldn't it be a D4? Then you're going to struggle a little bit with Pathfinder. It's a very well-constructed game. It truly is. It's well-constructed, and if every one of your players knows what they're doing, I imagine it would click on all cylinders all the time and roll beautifully. If they don't, I think you're going to have some problems. I think the Mythic Adventures here, I think adding this level of detail to your game is going to double your problems, if that's an issue for you. Truly, I do. I like this book. I like it a lot. There's a lot of good in here. A lot of good ideas, a lot of good options. I think Pathfinder has always been really good at giving you powers and options. The section on mythic level magic items alone is fantastic. If you want the Unnameable Game by White Wolf, that level of power and that level of, well, world-changing stuff, then, and you like Pathfinder, this is your one-stop shop for that level of power. And considering the size of this, adding this on to the Pathfinder Player's Guide, it's not that cumbersome to do. For Game Geeks, I'm your host, Kurt Wiegel. Good day and good gaming.